right, good. Good afternoon. It's good to be here. Thank you for coming. I want to begin maybe by quickly introducing who I am. Some of you may know a little bit about me, probably more about my family. My name is James Taylor, and I am the great-grandson of the founder of the China Inland Mission, J. Hudson Taylor, and I'll talk a little bit about him in a little bit. I was born and raised in Taiwan. My parents were missionaries. My grandparents were missionaries. My great-grandparents were missionaries, and their parents, Hudson Taylor and Maria, were also missionaries. So I am in a long line of missionary, in a missionary family. My parents served in Taiwan for 25 years, and so together with my two older sisters, I have two other siblings, the three of us were raised in Taiwan. My parents, instead of sending us to an American school or an international school, sent us to local Chinese school. 所以我从小就讲中文. So I spoke Chinese growing up. In fact, together with my sister, we were the only non-Chinese in the entire school. And so there's a joke in our family that one day when my father was driving us to school, we asked him if he could drop us off several blocks before we got to the school gate. And of course he was very curious why we would have such a interesting request. And our response to him was we didn't want our classmates to know that our father was not Chinese. And so since then I've had something of an identity crisis. I'm not quite sure whether I'm an American or I'm a Caucasian or I am Chinese. And so some of my friends often refer to me as an egg because I am white on the outside but yellow on the inside. Now, as I look down on your faces, we probably have some bananas in our midst as well. And you know, a banana is yellow on the outside, but white on the inside. I won't ask you to raise your hand if you think you're a banana. But anyway, I was often referred to as an egg. And I said, I'm happy to be an egg. I don't want to be a 皮蛋, if you know what a 皮蛋 is. 1,000-year-old egg. I do not want to be a 1,000-year-old egg. But anyway. Even though I was born and raised in a Christian family, it wasn't until I was 18 years old that I came to a clear understanding that I needed to accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. And if for you grew up in a Christian family, like me, at some point in time, you're going to have to make a decision as to whether this faith is merely the faith of your parents, or it also now becomes your faith as well. And so it was at 18 years old that I clearly realized that I needed to accept Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior. That getting into heaven, in Chinese we say 搞关系. You cannot get into heaven by 关系. The Lord is not going to ask you whether your parents were Christians. The Lord is not going to ask you whether your grandparents were Christians. The Lord is going to say, have you ever accepted Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior? And so at the age of 18, I made that decision. I was studying in the central part of the island of Taiwan in a city called Taichung. And I still vividly remember the day I was baptized. It was Mother's Day, 1978. So you can about guess how young I am this year. 1978, I was baptized in the school swimming pool. And I remember the teacher who baptized me explained to me the reason why I was needing to be baptized in the swimming pool was because I had an innumerable amount of sin, and so I needed more water to cleanse me of my sin. Of course, he was joking. But just by way of note, probably one of the highlights of my life was 30 years later, well actually probably close to 40 years later, I had the opportunity of baptizing our two children, and I'll talk about our kids in just a moment. But I had the joy of baptizing our two kids, our oldest two, in the same swimming pool that I was baptized 40 years ago. And so that was a very moving moment for me as I stepped down into the swimming pool with my 2 kids. And I explained to everybody that 40 years previous, I stood in that very spot and I was baptized. And 40 years later, I had the joy of baptizing our 2 kids. Mimi, my wife, also born and raised in Taiwan. She is a Chinese, though, in comparison to me, a Caucasian. And in fact, she is the first Chinese in our family. And our family has been involved in ministry with the Chinese since my great-great-grandfather's day, from the times of Hudson Taylor. We've been involved in Chinese ministry, but not one of them married a Chinese until I'd made that decision to marry a Chinese. And I remember growing up being asked, why haven't any of you married Chinese? And so I made a decision I was going to marry a Chinese, and that question would never be asked again. No, I'm just joking. I married my wife not just because she's Chinese. We are a part of OMF, Overseas Missionary Fellowship. It used to be called the China Inland Mission. It was started by my great-great-grandfather in 1865. And so if your math is good and your math is quick, you'll know that this year is actually 150 years. So 150 years ago, on a beach in Brighton, and I'll talk a little bit about that a bit later, but Hudson Taylor, my great-great-grandfather, had a prayer. And this prayer was simply that God would raise up 24 workers to go with him to China. And that was the beginning of the China Inland Mission. It subsequently changed its name when we had to leave China in the 1950s to Overseas Missionary Fellowship, OMF International. And together with my wife, we are serving with OMF. We've been with OMF since 1990. And OMF is serving in Asia as well as among Asians. In Asia as well as among Asians, because we know that Asians are found not only in Asia, but they're also found in other parts of the world. For instance, just 2 months ago, actually a little bit more than a month ago, at the end of April, I had the joy of going to Siberia. And I was there for about 10 days, and I had the wonderful joy of sharing the gospel with many Chinese from the northeast part of China who are working in Siberia in different cities. And so we would go from city to city, from city to city, and in each city there would be these Chinese markets. I don't know if there's such a thing here in Melbourne, but they had these Chinese markets where wholesalers from China were selling clothing mostly, although they are also selling shoes. And so every 2 years I have the joy of going to Siberia to reach out to Chinese in Siberia. And so Asians are not only in Asia, they're in other parts of the world. And so OMF's vision is to reach Asia for Christ, to reach Asians for Christ. And so we have work in some 14, 15 different countries. We have about 1,400 missionaries from 40 different countries. And it's been a joy for us to be with OMF just about 25 years now. I mentioned we have 3 children, 1 boy and 2 girls. In my family, the Chinese name belongs to my wife. She's responsible for coming up with the Chinese name, and I'm responsible for coming up with the English name. And so we have a division of responsibility. But in the end, I think I got the short end of the stick, so to speak, because when our first child was born, he was a male, and I suddenly realized that I didn't have much choice in thinking of a very creative name for him. I just had to change the number on the end for his name. So actually our son James, who is 21 years old, he's in his 4th year of university in the United States. His name is actually identical to my name. And my name is identical to my father's name, whose name is identical to his father's name. So some people say we lack creativity in our family. We can't come up with many other names except James Hudson Taylor. And then we change the number on the back. And so I say, what we lack in creativity, we make up for math. We're very good in math. So we've gotten up to 5. And hopefully the Lord will return in the not too distant future. So we don't have to compete with Henry VIII. If you know about your British history, there was a king called Henry VIII. And I don't think we want James VIII. We'll be happy with the Lord coming back sooner than that. But we have one son, and then we have two daughters. Selena is our middle child's name, and then our youngest child's name is Joy. And so the three of them, Selena is in university, also in the United States, and Joy, our youngest, just finished her 10th grade year. I'm not sure of the academic system, the schooling system here. In the West, in America, they go up through grade 12. Do you guys do grade 12? It's 1 to 12 here as well. You don't do Form 1, Form 2, the British system? Okay, all right, well, good enough. So, but you have grade 13, right?
No, uni.
You go straight into uni. Okay, all right, there you go. Well, we're the same as you guys then. Or you guys are the same. Anyway, we're the same. So, but that's a little bit about my background. I'm actually a little bit nervous to speak to you guys in English because I don't actually get a chance to share in English very often. I usually do most of my sharing in Mandarin Chinese. So I usually don't think I do a very good job of sharing in English. And so this will be an interesting experience for me. But hopefully it'll be a good time together. I thought what I can do is just to share a little bit about God's grace in our family and some testimonies of how God has worked in our family over the years. And in many ways, if you want to talk about God's grace in our family, it doesn't even really begin with Hudson Taylor. It begins with the great-grandfather of Hudson Taylor. Okay, and so that's a long, long time ago. That's actually over 200, close to 300 years ago that God's grace began in the Taylor family. Hudson Taylor's great-grandfather, believe it or not, also was called James Taylor. So we have a real problem with this name. We have a real fixation with this name. But he was born and raised in the 18th century, and again, that was a very, very long time ago. He was very antagonistic, actually, to the gospel of Jesus Christ. He had no time for the Christian faith. And in fact, he sought out opportunities to ridicule people, to make fun of people who believed in Jesus Christ. And one of the things that him and his friends liked to do from time to time is when they would hear about a preacher coming to town. And back then in England, one of the things was you had what they called the state church, or what is called the Church of England, the Anglican church. And then they had the free church. And that was basically people who did not belong to the Anglican church, but felt for various reasons that they still wanted to meet together. And so you had what we call the free church in addition to the Anglican church. Well, James Taylor wasn't a part of either one of them, and he particularly got a kick out of and enjoyed the opportunity of troubling free church preachers when they came to town. Actually, probably more specifically, Methodist preachers when they came to town. And so whenever they heard about a Methodist preacher coming to town, what he and his friends would do is they would load their pockets full of ammunition. They didn't take a gun. That wasn't their ammunition. Their ammunition was tomatoes, however you want to say it, and eggs. And they would take these things to listen to this preacher who often didn't preach in a church. And in fact, they weren't really even allowed in churches. But they would preach in the marketplace. They would carry around a wooden box, and they would, in the middle of the marketplace, put this box down, and they would stand on this box, and they would begin to preach away. How old is this building here? 150 years or something like that. 300-year-old building still exists. Well, he got on his clothes and he made a wild dash for the church. And as he was running, of course, there was this clock on top of the church. And he was very thankful because it looked like he was going to be on time for his wedding. Except afterwards he found out that his friends had actually pushed the clock back. So he thought he was on time, but actually he was 2 hours late for his wedding. And so you can about imagine the bride was not a happy bride that day. You know, how can you be late for such an auspicious occasion, such an important occasion? How can you be possibly late to your own wedding? Well, I'll tell you what, that upset her, but what upset her more was that when he got there, he announced that he was a Christian. And so her immediate response is, 很倒霉, what a misfortune. I got married to a Methodist. My life is ruined. And so they didn't start their married life off on a very positive note, not in addition to being late for the wedding. But now she was married to a Christian. That was a boring thing for her as far as she was concerned. Well, James Taylor prayed for Betty, was her name. Prayed for his wife over and over again, and really was very burdened, and prayed that God would open her heart to accept Jesus Christ as her Lord and Savior. And as the story goes, one day he was just very burdened for his wife. So after the meal, he did something that I wouldn't recommend anybody do today. But he picked up his wife. He picked up Betty in his arms, and he carried her up to their room, their bedroom. And he knelt down beside their bed, and he made Betty kneel down beside him. And she, of course, tried to stand up, but he was a stronger man than she was, and so with one hand he forced her down there so she could not get up. Now, again, don't do that today, or else they'll call and say domestic violence. So we don't want to do that to our wives or our spouses today, or maybe to our children, whatever. But he held her down, and of course, as he held her down with one hand, he fervently prayed that God would work in Betty's heart. God would work in Betty's heart. And an amazing thing took place. As he was pouring out his heart to God, he suddenly heard Betty cry. And it wasn't because she was in pain, but rather the Holy Spirit was at work in her heart. And that day, right beside that bed in their bedroom, Betty gave herself to Jesus Christ as well. And so that was really the beginning of God's grace in my family. 4 generations before Hudson Taylor was born. 4 generations before Hudson Taylor was born. Could I just very quickly pause, because I love that story at the end of Joshua. We've already talked a little bit about it, where Joshua calls the Israelites together and gives them this challenge. Who will you serve? Who will you serve? It's interesting, actually, if you go and study the book of Joshua, that it begins with a family and it ends with a family. I wonder if you've ever noticed that. It begins with a family and it ends with a family. Do you remember what family the book of Joshua begins with? A very different kind of a family. It wasn't a Jewish family, it was a Gentile family. It wasn't the family of a general like Joshua. Actually, it was a prostitute's family. And her name, if you're familiar with the book of Joshua, was what? Rahab. Remember that? Rahab. And so Joshua chapter 2 tells us about Rahab's family. And of course you remember that Rahab, this harlot, this prostitute, she hid 2 spies that were sent by Joshua to spy out Jericho. Do you remember that story? Mm-hmm. And she daringly protected them from the king of Jericho, or else they would have lost their lives. And there in chapter 2 of the book of Joshua, we have a wonderful story of a woman and her faith that led to the salvation of her family. A woman and her faith who led to the salvation of her family. But it's interesting that Joshua doesn't end there, because as we've already talked about, at the end of the book of Joshua, there's another family, Joshua's family. And there we have a picture of not so much a family saved, but a family committed to serve. And if anything, if you forget everything else this afternoon that I'll share with you, I hope that you will not forget this, that we are saved to serve. Each and every one of us, we are saved to serve. And so the question that I'd like to ask you is, how are you serving Jesus today? How are you being a witness for Jesus? How are you living for Jesus? All of us are saved, but we're saved to serve. We're saved to serve. Well, if we were to skip several generations down the road, we would come to the generation of my great-great-grandfather, Hudson Taylor. And of course, perhaps many of you have read his story. He was born, like me, in a very devout Christian home, but just like me as well, he went through a time of tremendous rebellion. And he wasn't interested in the Christian faith. He wasn't interested in the Christian faith. But something happened when he was 17, 18 years old that turned his life around. And one day he was actually working in a bank then, and he had a day off. And so he went home, and back then they didn't have smartphones, they didn't have computers. So he couldn't play Nintendo, he couldn't play Sony Playbox, he didn't have any of this to play with. It was pretty boring back then, if you think about it. And he didn't have anything to do with his time. But he remembered that his father, in his study, in his dad's study, his dad had a lot of gospel stories, or what we would call tracts, used to pass out to people to encourage them to accept Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. And so Hudson Taylor didn't know what to do, and so he said, well, I'll go into my dad's study and I'll take out one of these tracts and I'll read a little bit about a good story. Now let me let you in on a little secret about these tracts, if you don't know already. They always have a very moving story in the beginning. A very moving story. Very interesting story. And then once they grab your attention, then they got you. Because then they'll tell you, well, now you need to believe in Jesus. And so Hudson Taylor, he was a smart little kid. And he knew that that was the case. And so he decided, well, I'll tell you what. I'm going to read the front end of the tract, and then I'll toss it when it comes to that part of it. I'm not interested in that part of it. And so that's what he did. He sat down, he picked up a tract, and he began to read it. We're not told what kind of story it was, but it was actually quite evidently a very interesting story. And so he was reading and reading it until that part of the tract where, tells you, well, now you need to accept Jesus Christ as your Savior. And he decided that he wasn't interested in that. But just there at the very point in which he was about ready to toss out that tract, there was a phrase, there was a statement in there that grabbed Hudson Taylor's heart. It was actually something that Jesus said on the cross. If you've studied the Bible, if you studied the Gospel, you know that Jesus said 7 statements on the cross. 7 things. After Jesus was crucified, he said on the cross. Do you remember what the last thing he said on the cross? Do you remember what it was? It is finished. It is finished. And it was that "it is finished," those 3 words, that struck Hudson Taylor, and he asked himself, what is finished? What is finished? Why did Jesus say, "It is finished" on the cross? And of course, later on he understood what that meant. And it simply meant this, that the work of salvation had been already accomplished through the cross of Jesus Christ. The work of salvation has been accomplished. It's finished. We don't need to do anything more to earn salvation. We don't need to do anything more to merit salvation. It is finished. Jesus completed God's redemption for mankind. Could I pause there for just a moment? Because in many ways, when we think about that, we realize that that is actually something very unique in the world. There are 9,000 religions in the world today. That's a lot of religions. 9,000 religions. Now, I've not studied all of them, but of the ones that I have studied, Christianity, the faith of this Bible, there is something very, very different than all of the other religions in the world. And it is simply this: grace. 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 In no other religion in the world, in those 9,000 religions, in no other religion will you find this concept of grace. Let me give you a quick definition of what grace means. And if you can remember this, that would be wonderful. What is grace? It's simply this: God's riches at Christ's expense. Grace. God's riches, God, are riches, A, at, C, Christ's, E, expense. God's riches at Christ's expense. G-R-A-C-E, grace. In other words, we don't have to earn this salvation. We don't have to merit this salvation. You know, that's very unique, as I mentioned already. In all of the religions of the world, there is no such concept of grace. Let me ask you a question. How many of you seen Tibetan Buddhists going on pilgrimage to Lhasa? Maybe some of you have seen them on the television. How many have seen Tibetan Buddhists? The Dalai Lama is here in Australia right these days. I noticed, I think he arrived the day before I got here. Tibetan Buddhism. How many of you have seen, has anyone seen on television? Okay, some people have seen it. You know, it's very interesting what they do. Actually, if you get a chance, you can go onto YouTube. You guys watch YouTube here? Huh? You guys get YouTube here? Or is that an American thing? It's an Aussie thing too? You guys have YouTube here too? Okay. Well, maybe you can go on YouTube and check it out. But what they do actually is every 3 steps, they will sprawl out onto the ground, face down onto the ground. And so some of them will do this for a number of days as they make their way to Lhasa, which is the capital of Tibet in southwest China. Every 3 steps, they'll sprawl down on the ground, facing down with their arms stretched out. And then they'll get up and they'll take 3 steps again and they'll sprawl down again. And some of them will do this for several days. Almost, some of them have wooden boards on their knees, because you could about imagine after you do this so many times, you start rubbing holes in your pants. And then it starts bleeding and it becomes very sore. And so they'll have protection all over their body so that they can do this as they make their way to Lhasa. Well, if you ever see that, I've seen it a number of times, I've often wondered, why do they do that? And I think there are 2 reasons why they do that. One of the reasons is because they have a reverence for their God or their gods. And so they want to show how devout they are to their gods. So they're very religious people. They're very religious people. You know, sometimes when I think about that, I think, boy, we as Christians have a lot to learn even from them. Because sometimes when we come to church, we're doing God a favor by showing up in church. And you know, we think, hey, it doesn't make any difference how we behave in church. You know, so sometimes we have a lot to learn from these people. But you know, the other reason why they do that is simply this. For every time they bow down, they believe that they're earning their salvation. They're earning their salvation. That they're meriting their salvation. Now, I want to be very careful, because I'm not making fun of any other religions. I'm not mocking them. I'm not wanting to belittle them. That's not what I'm doing. But that's why they do it. And of course, the question that we have to face, and probably they face, is they will actually never be sure that they bow down enough times. Do you understand what I'm saying? They will never know whether they have bowed down enough times, whether they have gone on pilgrimage enough times to earn their salvation. They will never have that assurance. They will never have that confidence. They will always wonder whether I need to do it once more. And I say that only to explain to you that when Jesus on the cross said, "It is finished," that is one of the most amazing statements that you will ever find. And because of that accomplished work of salvation, you and I don't have to earn our salvation. We don't have to merit our salvation. God, through Jesus Christ, has already completed His salvation of grace on the cross of Jesus Christ. It is finished. It is finished. And that was the phrase that caught Hudson Taylor's heart that day. Well, the amazing thing is his mom wasn't at home when this all happened. His mom was actually several tens of miles or kilometers away at a relative's house. And just about the same time, as the story is told to us, just about the same time, Hudson Taylor's mother had a tremendous burden for her son and for the salvation of her son. And so she excused herself. She went up to the room where she was staying at. She closed the door. She locked the door, and she knelt down on the bed, beside the bed, and began to pray for her son, for Hudson Taylor. Even though he was so far away, she began to pray and ask God to work in his heart, to turn his heart to God. And afterwards, when they compared notes, they figured out that just as she was praying, Hudson Taylor was reading. And just as she was praying, God worked in Hudson Taylor's life. And so that was God's grace in Hudson Taylor's life. An amazing story. And of course, very shortly thereafter, he gave himself to the Lord. And he said, Lord, if you want, I want to go to China as a missionary. And so at the young age of 21, a little bit older than quite a few of you here today, but for some of us, he was actually still a very young man at 21. But at 21, he left England and went to China. Now, this was a long time ago. It was in 1853. In September, he left England, and on a boat, the boat was called Dumfries. Dumfries. D-U-M-F-R-I-E-S. Dumfries. He traveled to China. You know how long it took him to get to China? It took him 163 days before he arrived in China. That's called the slow boat to China. 163 days before he got to China. Now, maybe I can pause there very quickly, because one of the things I wanted to share with you this afternoon was actually in the world that we live in today, the opportunities for us to be involved in missions is far more convenient for you and me as it was for Hudson Taylor and those early missionaries. You just think about it. It took him 163 days to get from England to China. Now, I won't ask you how long it takes to fly from England to China. How long does it take to fly from Australia to China? Does anybody know?
9 hours.
How many?
9 to 10 hours.
9 to 10 hours. Okay, well, that's fairly close. If we were to go from Heathrow, which is in London, and we would fly to Shanghai, one of the big airports in Shanghai is Pudong Airport. If we were to fly from London to Pudong Airport, it would take us about 12 to 13 hours. So it's a little farther than from Melbourne. And so if you think about it, what took Hudson Taylor nearly half a year to do, you and I can do in half a day. What it took him half a year to do, you and I can do in half a day. And you know, I think God has graced this generation with the convenience of transportation. And with that transportation, we have a lot of opportunities to be involved in missions in ways that Hudson Taylor's day could never be involved in. He could never be able to do. Because after all, think about it for a moment. It took him half a year to get there, and took him half a year to come right back. That's a whole year, right? That's a long time. But today, because of convenience of transportation, we can go to the other ends of the world. My family lives in Hong Kong today. I arrived the day before yesterday. And it took me from Hong Kong about 8 hours to get here. I think if I was on a boat from Hong Kong to Australia to Melbourne, I'd still be somewhere in the South China Sea somewhere. So because of the convenience of transportation, we have a wonderful opportunity today to tell people, whether it's close by or far away, about the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so at the age of 21, Hudson Taylor went to China. He went to China. Now, there are many stories that I can tell you about his experience in China, but I want to just share several with you, and you've been a good audience today. Thank you for listening so carefully. I appreciate that. And I want to just tell you several stories, and then we will close. I'll let you guys go. One of the interesting stories about Hudson Taylor when he first got to China was he went to China during a time that we refer to as the Qing Dynasty. The Qing Dynasty. The Mongols reigned and ruled China for well over 300 years through the Qing Dynasty. And one of the things about the Qing Dynasty was simply this, that all the men had to grow a queue. Do you know what a queue is? It's like a ponytail. So all the men had to grow a ponytail. Well, when Hudson Taylor first arrived in China, he was wearing his Western clothing. And he didn't think much about it, except he started to realize that a lot of the Chinese thought his clothing was very funny. Very funny. And one time, something happened that really convinced him that he needed to take off his Western clothing and put on Chinese clothing. Was one time he was preaching in Songjiang, which is not far from Shanghai. If you're from that area or your parents are from that area, they'll know. He was preaching in Songjiang, and he noticed that there was a Chinese man looking at his clothing, just with a great deal of interest. And when he had finished, this Chinese man came up to him and said, "Teacher Taylor, can I ask you a question?" Actually, he said, "Can I ask you an honorable question?" And he said, "I would like to know, what are those two honorable buttons doing on your honorable coat?" They were very polite back then. "What are those two buttons doing on your honorable coat?" And what it was at the back of Hudson Taylor's jacket, he had two buttons there. And this Chinese man was quite interested. What are those two buttons for? He couldn't figure it out. And so he said, "Honorable Taylor, Teacher Taylor, what are those two honorable buttons doing on your honorable coat?" Well, Hudson Taylor didn't know how to answer that question. It'd be similar to if you were to ask me today, "Pastor Taylor, what are these four buttons doing on your suit jacket?" You know, to this day, I haven't figured out why they put buttons on these suit jackets. I should ask these two gentlemen sitting in front here. I've always wondered why. Now, somebody would kindly say, "Oh, that's easy, because if you lose one of these buttons, you have four here to bring over. So you can lose a lot and you wouldn't have a problem." Well, except to say, the size of these buttons are very different. You know, one time I went on to Google and I searched for an answer for this. And I don't know if the answer I found was the right answer, but I thought it was a pretty interesting attempt to explain. You know, actually these buttons originally weren't there. These buttons originally were on the top. They were invented by the French, and why did they invent them, or why did they put the buttons here, was back then, men didn't carry around hankies or handkerchiefs. And so if they needed to wipe their nose, what would they do? That's easy. They would just sleeve like that, boy, and that would get the job done. But the French thought that was pretty disgusting. Ooh, you know, you have all of this stuff on your sleeve. That's not very good. So, in their attempt to discourage people from using their sleeves to wipe their noses, they brought these buttons onto the top, and so you can about imagine if you wipe your nose on those four buttons, that would hurt your nose. And so that's how the story goes. I don't know if that's what Google told me, so you can take it for what it's worth. I thought it was a pretty good attempt to answer the question. And anyway, they eventually invented handkerchiefs, and so slowly the buttons made their way down to the bottom. And that's why we have buttons down here. They have no use whatsoever today, because no one can wipe their nose like that. That's pretty difficult. What were those two buttons for? What were those two buttons for? And Hudson Taylor suddenly realized that actually what he was wearing became a barrier to the Chinese. Because then they thought, well, this religion is a Western religion. How many of you can understand Chinese? Can you raise your hand? Okay, most of you. If I was to say 吃洋教, do you understand what that means? To eat Western religion. 吃东西的吃 to eat. 洋教 is Western religion. 吃洋教. And that used to be something that was said in China, that if you became a Christian, you are 吃洋教. You are eating Western religion. That this is not a Chinese religion. Well, of course, we all know that this religion is not a Western religion. It's actually a world religion. It's actually the only world religion. If we had the chance to talk about that more, that would be wonderful. It is the only world religion to this very day. Well, he suddenly realized that, man, this is not right. What I need to do is to take off my Western clothing and to put on Chinese clothing and to identify with the Chinese as much as possible. And so that's what he did. Not only did he take off his Western clothing, but he actually started to grow a ponytail. And I didn't bring it with me today. Actually, every generation they've passed down a strand of Hudson Taylor's hair to each generation. And so I have one in my possession that I'll pass on to my son at some point in time. What it was when he went back to England in 1860, he had already been in China for about 6 years. He had quite a ponytail. But when we went back to England, that would have looked very funny for a man to have a ponytail in England. And so he dutifully cut off his ponytail. And what he did was he made it into two watch bands, and he gave them as a present to his parents. And so his ponytail has been passed down through the generations. And you know, sometimes I'll pull out that little plastic bag that it is in, and I'll look at it and I'll thought, man, he had hair to cut, and I don't even have hair to grow. I don't know if we can transplant hair 150 years later. That would be an interesting thing to do. But let me tell you, actually, that was not an easy decision for Hudson Taylor to make. Many people made fun of him, but he was convinced that the gospel can be translated. And what I mean by that is not only the Bible translated, but the gospel can be translated into any kind of a culture. That it is important for us to take away all the unnecessary things, and Western clothing was unnecessary, so that the Chinese could accept the gospel of Jesus Christ without thinking that they had to be less Chinese. And so as I look over your faces, I want to tell you, you don't have to be less Chinese if you become a Christian. That you can be just as Chinese and a Christian as I am an American and a Christian as well. And so there's much more we can talk about that, but that was very significant. In missions, we call that contextualization. And if you don't remember that word, that's all right. That's a very sophisticated word. But it's actually a very important word in missions, actually as also in church work as well. And we believe that the message does not change. The gospel of Jesus Christ, God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that who believes in him shall not perish but have everlasting life. That message does not change. But the method we communicate to that message can be different depending on who we're sharing it with. And so that's the first thing that I want to tell you about Hudson Taylor's experience. Well, there was a second thing that was also very, very significant in his life. And it was also while he was in Shanghai. And he was traveling to the northern part of Shanghai. There's a small island just north of Shanghai. It's called Chongming Island. If you're from China, maybe some of our adults will know. Chongming Island. It's a very tourist kind of a place today. But Hudson Taylor went there to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ. And one day while he was there preaching, something happened that absolutely impacted his life. After he had preached a gospel message, a Chinese came up to him and thanked him for telling him about Jesus Christ. And actually this Chinese man said, my heart has been deeply moved, and actually I want to accept Jesus Christ as my Savior. But could I ask you a question? Could I ask you a question before I accept Jesus Christ? And Hudson Taylor said, yeah, you can ask me. And this Chinese man asked Hudson Taylor this: how long have you had the gospel in your country? How long have you had the gospel in your country? Well, before Hudson Taylor had the chance to even answer this question, this young Chinese man went on to say that my father spent his whole life searching for the truth I heard you tell about today. He sought it in animism, that is, worshiping idols. He sought it in Buddhism.
He sought it in Confucianism. He sought it in Taoism. But he never found it. He said, not only did my father spend his whole life searching for this, my grandfather spent his whole life searching for this as well, and did not find it. How long have you known the gospel in your country? Well, Hudson Taylor had to answer that question. And Hudson Taylor said to this young man, actually, this gospel has been in England for several hundreds of years. Several hundreds of years. To which this young man said back to Hudson Taylor this. He said to him, why have you taken so long to come? Why have you taken so long to come? And you know, that was very, very impactful in Hudson Taylor's life, because he realized that it is so important for us as believers of Jesus Christ to tell other people about the good news of Jesus Christ. And I want to just close with one last story. Actually, I brought a very special Bible in our family with me today. This Bible is over 150 years old. And I can't open it up. You can see there's a ribbon tied on it, because this is the Bible. I talked a little bit earlier about Hudson Taylor down in Brighton in 1865 when he prayed for 24 willing workers to go with him to China. And this was the Bible that he had in his hand that day. I call this the Brighton Bible because he was in Brighton, which is in the southern part of England. Is there a Brighton here in Australia?
Yes.
Okay, all right. Well, then you're familiar with that name, Brighton. And I've come to realize you guys have a lot of names similar to the United States. Also, a lot of places. We have a Brighton in Massachusetts as well, in the northwest part of the United States. So I imagine somebody from Brighton went to the United States and decided, well, hey, we're going to call this place Brighton. And somebody from Brighton came to Australia and said, hey, we're going to call this place Brighton. That's probably how it happened. That's my guess. But I call this the Brighton Bible. The Brighton Bible. It was a Sunday morning, June 25th. Just in several days from now, it will be the 150th anniversary. And Hudson Taylor was down in Brighton. He was down in Brighton and he went to church that morning. But you know, it was hard for him to worship God that day. Why? Because he thought of the millions and millions and millions of Chinese in China who had never heard the gospel of Jesus Christ. You know, back in Hudson Taylor's day, there were 300 million Chinese. Do you know how many Chinese there are in China today? Does anybody know? Well, actually, probably no one knows specifically, but they tell us that there are probably about 1.3 billion Chinese in China today. Man, what's the population of Australia? How many? 0.3 million. 22, 23 million. Okay, well, just imagine. It's hard to even imagine 1.3 billion people compared to 22, 23 million people in Australia. Just think of that. How many times is that? My math is not very good. I've only got up to 5. Quite a few times, but that's a huge difference. Well, there were about 300 million Chinese back in Hudson Taylor's day. And he thought to himself, when will anybody be willing to go to tell the Chinese about Jesus Christ? He thought to himself, you know, if we truly believe that Jesus is not a way, but rather he is the way. You know, and I know that's not maybe a popular thing to say in the world we live in today, because we live in what we call a very pluralistic society. And what we mean by that is simply this, that there are no absolutes, that there are no rights and wrongs. If it's right for you, great, that's good for you. But your good might not be my good. Your right might not be my right. Your truth might not be my truth. So we live in a very relative world. That's the case in the United States. That's the case probably here in Australia as well. In a very pluralistic society. But Hudson Taylor knew that Jesus wasn't just a way. Hudson Taylor knew that Jesus Christ was the way. And no one can get to the Father but through Jesus Christ. And so that day, as they were worshiping, there were about 1,000 people worshiping in that church. But Hudson Taylor's heart wasn't there because he thought of those 300 million Chinese. Well, as the story goes, he went out to the beach, Brighton Beach, with his Brighton Bible. And he thought of those 300 million Chinese who still needed the gospel of Jesus Christ. And so in this Bible, I'm sorry I can't open it. It will literally fall apart. But in this Bible, he wrote down his prayer. 24 willing and skillful workers for China. You know, we live 150 years later. And yet the need for missionaries is just as important and just as needed. There were 1.3 billion Chinese in China. Today there are over 7 billion people in the world, of which nearly a third, which comes out to be about 2.5 or so billion people, still do not have access to the gospel of Jesus Christ. They still need people to tell them that Jesus died for their sins. And so just as in Hudson Taylor's day, God is looking for people today who will tell people about Jesus Christ. And so it's been wonderful to share some stories from my family with you this afternoon. But I just close with that phrase that I talked about, highlighted just very quickly. Each of us are saved to what? Saved to serve. Saved to serve. We are saved to stand. We are saved to shine. We are saved to share. And we are saved to serve. Thank you very much. Very powerful. This afternoon. Thank you for the chance of sharing a little bit about your grace in our family. And Lord, I'm confident that just as you are writing the story of grace in our family, that for each family here, you are also writing a story of grace. A story of salvation, and Lord, a story that we are called to serve you. We are saved to serve. And so, Lord, I pray that through these stories, you will, first of all, just impress upon us the need for salvation. And just as Hudson Taylor's great-grandfather needed salvation, just as Hudson Taylor needed to hear about it is finished. Lord, if there would be anyone here this afternoon that has never accepted Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior, Lord, I pray that this afternoon you would open up their hearts. Thank you that we have an assurance of salvation. And all we need to do is to accept Jesus Christ, to confess that we're a sinner and we need Jesus' salvation, and to accept him into our hearts. Just like Hudson Taylor did. Just like Hudson Taylor's great-grandfather did. Just like what I did when I was 18 years old. Yet, Lord, we're also reminded that we are saved to serve. And so help us, Father, to not only have faith and experience salvation, but help us, Lord, wherever you may place us, wherever we may be, help us to live for you. And we'll be careful to give you all the praise and the glory, for it's in Christ's name we pray. Amen. 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 Good. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon, a good evening.